Lieutenant Jeffries navigated into the Shepherd's shuttle bay. She parked the shuttle next to the other three facing out. As soon as the airlock sealed, Captain Gardner and two ensigns rushed into the bay. As Jeffries, Klein, and Bren hopped out, Gardner waved them to him. "They'll get your bags. I need you all on the bridge, now." As they followed, Gardner filled in the details, not that there were many. "We detected an automated distress call. It was a default message designed to trigger if there was a problem with the ship." He seemed more rushed than usual. Klein picked up on it. "Captain, is there something else?" Gardner turned the last corner onto the bridge. Jeffries was about to take her usual station, but Gardner stopped her. "We also received a message from the Klon Collective and a message from Jessica on Gaia. Apparently, there's a civil war beginning on Sell. It started with a slave revolt driven by the news that Sell had been disqualified from joining the Collective. Again." He turned to Jeffries. "I'm sorry to say, Lieutenant, that there are warrants for you and me from our antics on Gaia. We're war criminals." He made the quotation marks gesture as he said it. Jeffries smiled. "So I'm famous?" Gardner frowned. "Not for the best reason, I'm afraid. Bren, the council sent a longer message for you. They just gave me the basic details. The message is in your comm center." Bren quickly pulled out his pad device and began reading. Gardner directed Jeffries to take her station. "Jessica told me that a few slaves had made their way to Gaia. She believes it is Gaia's will, but we'll need to keep an eye on them. Like it or not, we're getting dragged into this." Gardner sat in his chair and turned to Jeffries. "Ready to jump?" "Ready." She waited, finger poised to push the button. Klein made the announcement, and Gardner nodded. Jeffries pushed the button, and they snapped away. The Shepherd dropped into empty space in front of a medium-sized stray ship. It was adrift and rotating off axis. Gardner looked at Klein. "Is this the origin of the distress call?" Klein looked. Yes, it is. Sir, the ship is adrift and open to space. There are no signs of hibernation pods or life signs. There is a large section of the hull that appears to have been cut open." Gardner sighed. "I'm guessing they didn't go out for dinner. Klein, Bren, go see what you can find out." Jeffries popped up out of her seat. "Captain, matching the ship's rotation might be tricky. I have experience." Gardner frowned but agreed, waving her to join the other two. Matching the rotation was indeed tricky, and it took several minutes for Jeffries to lock on to the ship. Finally, she was able to dock. The ship was open to space, so they all had environment suits on, stepping carefully into the wrecked ship. As they entered, it was clear that the hatch had been cut open. They moved slowly, mag boots clamping onto the floor as the ship twirled. They reached the main storage bay and saw the empty spots where hibernation pods had once sat, clamped down to the floor in rows. Another door sat across the bay, and Klein headed over. He found what he was looking for, the ship's manifest. He gathered any other pertinent papers, glanced around the control area, and rejoined Bren and Jeffries. They were examining the pod areas. Bren pushed a button on his suit's arm. "It appears the pods were functioning when they were taken. I've looked at 3 machines, and they all show nominal until abruptly going offline." Klein looked at a nearby readout. "Any way to tell how long?" Bren pushed a few buttons, and the readout came to life. It showed an error message as there was no pod to operate. Bren looked, then stopped. "Commander, I recognize numbers, and I can speak your language, but I haven't learned to read it. Would you mind?" Klein laughed and stepped over to Bren. He looked at an old-style digital readout. "It just says error." Klein pushed a few buttons and found what he was looking for, a timestamp. He pushed a few more buttons and did some mental math. "About 3 hours. We were very close." He was about to report to the Shepherd when a message came in from Gardner. "Mr. Klein, unless you need more time, get back here. We just got another distress call. This one appears to be live." Jonah Davis was jolted awake by a surge of adrenaline as part of the wake-up procedure. He lay in his pod waiting. After a few minutes, the brain fog lifted. He flipped the handle and the pod opened. He exited carefully, allowing his body to adapt to the movement. Being weightless made it easier, but it still took time. He made his way to a machine and found a switch, lighting up this section of the cargo area. He grabbed the jacket hanging up and slipped on the thick boots, flinching as the cold material touched his body. The ship automatically turned life support on before waking him, but it was always cold. It didn't matter what the temperature readout said. It was cold. He opened a small box and pulled out the water and protein bar he had set aside last time. He would only be awake for 2 days, so needed to make sure he didn't eat or drink too much, just enough to take the edge off before going back into hibernation. This was the 3rd time he had awakened. He knew that he could have relied on the alarm system instead of regular inspections, but he was afraid the alarm might go off too late, so every 10 years he walked through the ship, checking every station and system. He climbed the ladder to each level, checking the pods. He had lost 3 people so far, mostly natural causes, so to speak. Not everyone can survive 90 years of hibernation. He held a simple ceremony before releasing their bodies to space, as had been agreed upon by all passengers prior to leaving Earth. There were no hibernation issues, and he made his way to the cockpit area. He floated along the central frame of the ship. He reached the end and suddenly heard a thump. He figured it was either a bit of space debris or just metal shifting as the life support brought the interior temperature up. But then he heard another sound. Then another. He quickly jumped to the cockpit, finding the only gun on the ship. Using a gun inside was a dangerous maneuver, so he hoped it wouldn't be necessary. He checked his communication system, and seeing nothing, he hid behind a row of cabinets and waited. Before long, he saw a shower of sparks emerge from around the central hatch. Someone was cutting in. It was slow going. He had reinforced the hatches with titanium and thick steel frames. It would take some time. He also realized that the central hatch had a manual airlock that wasn't inflated. It looked like atmosphere was barely venting, but that wouldn't last. He pushed off to the main cargo area floating through the ship. He found an environment suit and pushed back to the cockpit. He switched to the mag boots and put the full suit on. The gloves were a little thick, but he already knew he could fire the gun if needed. He checked fuel levels. His ship, the Essex, was fine. Plenty of extra fuel. He knew slowing would add months or even years to the trip, but maybe he could shake them off. He started flipping switches, all the while checking over his shoulder. Atmosphere was definitely venting now, but before he could put the airlock in place, he needed to shake off the leeches. As soon as the reverse engines leveled up, he flipped a switch, turning them on. The cutting stopped. He heard 2 thumps before firing the thrusters up on the reverse engines. The ship immediately began to slow down. He looked into the main cargo bay. Everything was properly locked down. As the Essex slowed, another ship moved into view through the small portal on the side of the ship. He watched a shuttle float inside the ship, and the ship disappeared. Stunned, he sat staring a moment, realizing the likelihood that the ship had so-called impossible faster-than-light travel. His brain drifted to various FTL theoretical concepts before quickly remembering he was venting atmosphere. He stuffed the gun into a pocket and pushed off to the beam above the central hatch. He climbed down the beam and engaged his mag boots. As he inflated the manual airlock, he mused that by the time they reached Proxima Centauri 2, he would have mastered weightlessness. Once the airlock was in place, he went in to inspect the damage. It wasn't nearly as bad as expected. He could fuse the gashes left behind with simple chemical weld tape. True welding in an oxygen-rich atmosphere was tricky and dangerous. Fortunately, they had only managed to cut through about 8 centimeters. He walked across the cargo bay to his makeshift workshop. He found the chemical tape and grabbed a few scraps of steel. He went back and forced the metal shards into the cut before slapping on a piece of tape. He exposed the open side and took another piece from a separate roll. He pushed the second piece onto the first and waited. After a moment, smoke rose and the tape shrank, sealing up the new vent so graciously made by his mystery guests. He decided to leave the airlock in place, just in case, but once the atmosphere read normal, he peeled off the suit, leaving the mag boots on. Now he had work to do. He released his boots and pushed off to the cockpit. Once locked in, he fired up the comm station. He sent a short distress call, including the date and approximate coordinates. He chose not to send the automated signal designed to show intelligence, instead sending the message in plain English, hoping it would be ignored by anyone else. While he knew no one would be coming, perhaps another sleeper ship might find them, or, should the ship somehow fail, there may be an answer as to why for some future generation. He figured the would-be intruders were looking for an easy score, and seeing someone awake inside scared them off. He decided he would stay awake for a week to make sure nothing else happened. He slowed the reverse engines until it was safe to fire up the forward engines again. Something told him to wait, however, and as he sat, deciding if he would dig into rations or just scrape by on protein bars, his instincts paid off. Hello, Earth ship Essex. This is the United Earth Federation ship Shepherd, and we are coming to help. ETA, 2 hours. This was a simple recording, likely sent over a great distance. He decided to dig into rations, and his mind drifted back to FTL drives, since it seemed pretty likely Earth had also mastered the impossible. He found a meatloaf dinner and added water, letting it rehydrate. It was probably terrible, but he now had no idea how long he'd be awake. He put his feet up on a nearby shelf and sat facing the small window. He put the meatloaf packet to his mouth and slurped in a chunk. It wasn't the worst thing he had ever eaten. Captain Gardner was the first to board the Essex. Klein and Chen were right behind. After the standard greetings, Gardner cut to the chase. "Captain Davis, did you see who tried to enter your ship?" Jonah smiled. "Captain Davis?" "I guess so, but calling me a captain seems inaccurate. I'm a ship builder." "And yes, I caught a short glimpse of the ship. Big, but it's hard to gauge how big. Wings and fuselage similar to a space shuttle. Silver and blue, I think. It's dark out here." Chen smiled. "My great-grandfather worked on the Chinese shuttle program." Jonah looked up. "I wonder if I knew him." Gardner cut off the discussion. "Stay on point, people. We can discuss history later." He turned to Jonah. "Captain, I would normally ask what you want to do, but given the circumstances, I am going to strongly suggest we awaken your passengers and bring them to the Shepherd." Jonah looked around the ship. Nathan would be so proud to see how well she lasted. He looked at Gardner. "My son." He had just joined the Space Force when the war started. "Do you know—" He paused, unable to finish the question. Gardner put a hand on his shoulder. "We can look once we get everyone safely on board. I would normally take a moment, but we are dealing with a crisis, and I really must insist we get going." Jonah nodded, and Chen pushed a button signaling her teams to begin the transfer. Jonah stood back and watched as the crews began to awaken passengers and dismantle the systems he had been responsible for over the last 3 decades. He was jolted out of his stupor by Gardner. "Captain, do you have a passenger manifest?" Jonah nodded and unlocked his mag boots, launching to the flight deck, retrieving a book, and launching back. He realized he would miss the weightlessness. He handed Gardner the book. Gardner began looking through it when Klein remembered something. "Sir, we had a curious manifest from the last ship. Most of the names were crossed out." Gardner thought a moment, then continued reading. Not finding any names he recognized, he handed the book back to Jonah. "Do you have family on the Essex?" Gardner asked. Davis shook his head no. Gardner turned to Chen. "Lieutenant, get these people to the Shepherd as quickly as possible. Personal items only. We can come back if needed." He turned to Jonah. "Come on, Captain. Let's see if we can identify the ship you saw." Gardner already knew from the description it was likely Sellane, and their civil war had impacted them already. As Gardner led Jonah off the ship onto the Shepherd, they were greeted by Bren. Jonah stopped in his tracks. Gardner assured him, "This is Commander Bren. He is the ambassador for his people to Earth. He is also my friend and can be trusted." Jonah relaxed as Gardner offered introductions. "Commander Bren, this is Captain Jonah Davis." Bren reached out both hands, and Davis followed suit. "Just Jonah, please. Now that I'm off the Essex, I have no claim to the title of captain." Gardner put a hand on his shoulder and led him towards the bridge. "The way I see it," he emphasized the word, "captain, it's not a situational title. Once you've earned it, you keep it." Jonah smiled as Bren led him onto the bridge. He began showing him ship designs, saving the Sellane fighter until he had seen a few others. Jonah stopped him on the Sellane ship. "That's it. That's the one." Although not surprised, Gardner was dismayed. "It seems we are being drawn into this war." Jonah looked concerned. "War?" Gardner looked again at the ship designs. "Captain, I promise I will tell you everything. These are not military secrets. The Sellane are a species in this area with a history of slave trade, and we clashed with them briefly." Gardner looked at Jonah, gauging his reaction. "Would you help acclimate your passengers for now? And I will tell Chen to give you all the information we have." Jonah recognized the crisis situation and nodded as an ensign stepped forward to lead him to the welcome area. "Of course, Captain. At some point, you'll have to tell me about the design of this ship." He looked around, running his hand along an edge. It seemed simple, but he carefully measured the curves. "It feels very familiar to me." Gardner, Klein, Bren, and Jeffries were on the bridge, gathering the information they had. Bren was giving a brief history of the Sellane slave trade. Klein interjected, "Eugenics?" Bren scanned his language model. "Commander, what you refer to as eugenics carries a negative connotation in your language. It does apply here, but you could use the same word to describe clon mating." Klein looked at him suspiciously. Bren continued, Sellane slaves have been bred for strength and stamina. The Kardjal, meanwhile, bred their ruling class for intelligence and beauty. Klein snorted. That was beauty? Bren continued. To them, yes. But it also led to inbreeding. Clon mating is designed to avoid inbreeding. We have an approved mating pool and have been careful to avoid those issues, as they did indeed cause problems 2,000 years ago. Jeffries piped in curiously. You have arranged marriages? Bren quickly shook his head. No, we are free to choose our mates. However, if we want to reproduce, we must get approval after genetic testing. I believe that our partnerships are not the same as human marriages. We choose mates for compatibility, both genetic and interpersonally, but we also choose mates based on how well our careers will match and based on whether we will reproduce. Reproducing couples are afforded easier careers and lifestyles to make child rearing a priority. The first 30 years of a child's development are critical. It is an honor and a sacred duty to raise a child properly. You may have noted my scientific background despite being a diplomat. All Klon learn extensive basics of scientific concepts, math, chemistry, physics, as well as artistic pursuits, language arts, and many other disciplines. Gardner interjected. I'm sure Mr. Klein meant no offense, Commander. Our eugenics bias is recent and tied closely to a massive Holocaust only 150 years ago. Bren smiled. No offense was taken. I simply wanted to point out that your word eugenics applies to multiple situations with very different goals and outcomes. Although I can understand your trepidation. Your dark past is still very recent. Ours is 2,000 or 3,000 years old and relegated to history studies. Gardner got them back on track. Mr. Bren, why did the Sellane continue slaving, knowing it could disrupt their admittance to the collective? Bren thought a moment. Most likely it was a few select Kardjal groups who took the slave system underground, so to speak. Free labor is difficult to replace. Technological advance is slow when you have a large labor force that is free and continually replenished. Bren thought a bit further. It is also worth noting that Cell is not a fully unified world and still operates on amassing wealth. In addition to Kardjal and slaves, there are several social levels that keep everyone in a particular standing. Different classes, all reinforced by their use of selective breeding. Klein looked unhappy and wasn't hiding it. Bren looked at him curiously. Klein looked up. I'm sorry, Bren. I did not mean to disparage your mating practices. I have many family members who were directly affected by the Holocaust the captain spoke of. Grandparents and great-grandparents who lived through those days. He paused. And many more who did not. It does cause me to overreact. Bren nodded. Of course, James. I understand. After a moment, Gardner started back to the matter at hand. Okay, what do? We have to assume that the Sellane have our pods. Obviously, we are not leaving without them. However, we are overmatched. He looked at Bren with a question on his mind. Bren picked up on it. Captain, I am your friend and I will help any way I can. However, the Klon Collective Ruling Council has instructed me specifically to not engage in any hostile behavior except in direct self-defense. My standing as an official ambassador has changed the impact that would have, and for now, the collective is not engaging with the Sellane. Gardner looked around. Okay, people, I need options. Mr. Bren, is there any way to track the Sellane? The pilot, Lieutenant Clark, interrupted the captain's discussion. Sir, that won't be necessary. She put the front view on all screens. A Sellane heavy fighter was resting in space right in front of them.